Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Patrick Biscuso. I am the Associate Director of the Information Security Oversight Office for CUI. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Ronald Ross. Dr. Ross is a very distinguished person, actually. He's a graduate of West Point, and he's a man of accomplishments, and he heads the Federal Information Security Management Act implementation project for the executive branch on behalf of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, where he is a fellow. If I were to give you some of the names of the publications he's authored, I think you will recognize them immediately. Let me just give you a sampling. The Federal Information Processing Standards Publication 199. The FIPS Publication 200. The NIST Special Publication 800-39. The SP 800-53. The 800-53A. I don't think I need to say anything more about the expertise of Dr. Ron Ross, and we're very pleased to have him with us today. He's a recipient of numerous awards and well-deserved. And he also is a partner in the development of the NIST Special Publication 800-171 with the Information Security Oversight Office. And we have done excellent work together, and I think that he's about to share some of it this afternoon. And without further ado, Dr. Ron Ross.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. It's great to see everybody here on this beautiful day. I love this time of year in Washington, D.C., and I was a little bit late coming in. I was watching all those wonderful airplanes going over. And you know, we're going to talk today about the 800-171, so we're going to get into the weeds a little bit, but I'd like to always start out. First of all, let me thank the NARA folks and ISOO in particular for hosting this event today and just being a great partner. John Fitzpatrick, Pat Viscuso, Mark Riddle, Devin Casey. I don't know if Devin's around here today. I'm not sure. They've been terrific partners in working on what I consider a really important project. We do a lot of important projects, but this one has special significance, and I hope when you leave today you'll understand a little bit more about why it's important. And that's what leads me into the context. I like to set the stage for any of the technical things we're going to talk about today. You know, this is a different world we live in today. We're in a high-tech era, and the technologies are coming out faster and faster. They're more powerful. We're standing in line at the Walmarts to get the iPhone 6s, and you have your tablets and smartphones loaded with applications. And we're building a very, very complicated, incredibly complex IT infrastructure. And we're having to figure this whole situation out as we go in some respects, because we're in a large transformation now from a paper-based world to a fully digital world. And there's going to be some things that we have to address that are not being confronted yet. And the 800-171 is starting to get into that territory a little bit. And I was thinking as I was coming into it, I was watching all those wonderful airplanes from World War II flying overhead. You kind of get goosebumps because you know, many of your family members, your grandfathers, your fathers, like my father, actually flew in those planes. And the one thing that I think is always important to remember, and it's again very poignant that we're here in the National Archives because this building, this institution, and the great people that work here are all about history. And we always have to remember history because there's lots of things that we can, you know, pitfalls that we can fall into going forward if we're not students of history. And so as I'm thinking about the World War II generation, and many of those folks are not with us anymore, every generation is called upon to do our part to defend the nation. And so you can talk about information security in very general terms. Did you configure your firewall? Did you do, you know, using your PIV cards? And, you know, are you encrypting this information? But you can lose sight of the bigger picture. Today, we are up against a very, very sophisticated set of adversaries. If you have access to classified threat data in the federal government, you might be able to see some of the really important threat information. We have reams and reams of information on cyber attacks that either have occurred or we expect to occur. The adversaries are getting more sophisticated, the malware is getting better, and we're asked to defend this very complicated infrastructure. So to me, when I get up every morning and I'm passionate about what I do, it's not just about cybersecurity or about the 171. This is about one very simple word, and it's called freedom. And freedom is incredibly hard to retain over the years. It doesn't just happen. You know, we're free because we defend ourselves, and generations have given their lives and blood and sweat and tears to preserve this wonderful country that we have and the freedoms that some of us take for granted. And so as we move into the digital world, there's going to be new forms of protection that we're going to have to be involved in that will be directly involved in defending the country. And we've had some very, very serious cyber breaches over the last several years. In fact, some of the worst ones were during the past couple of years. Some of our design documentation for some of the advanced tactical fighter aircraft, the F-35, were compromised. We had the USIS breach. How would you like to be someone going through a background check for a security clearance and have all that information dumped out there so the adversaries can grab onto that and either do the most sophisticated phishing attack or hold you up for blackmail? You see, this is the new world we're living in. Everything we do is based on some kind of computer technology, and that computer technology is driven by software and firmware. And that's where all of this story starts to take place with the 171. We deal a lot with the private sector. We deal with state and local governments, and the information is flowing freely over the networks. And so the 171 starts to address some of the problems that we're seeing in this massive transfer of information going from public sector to private sector, and what we have to do to be able to protect it. So now we have to get to some of the, I call the green eyeshade stuff. You have to go through some of the definitions to really understand, you know, the whole area of CUI. And to me, what's been so magnificent about the NARA and the ISOO executive agent leadership in this particular project, which started, by the way, back in 2010, is they have corralled and gotten a handle on a virtually totally out of control set of information types and just a whole classification system within the federal government. And that complexity was really hurting us. And so they took this whole area of controlled unclassified information. And of course, there are specific definitions that come out of the executive order, which I'm not going to read, but you can read that, the information. But it's specific information that's been singled out, and it requires specific safeguarding or dissemination controls on that information. So it's special in some way. And so when I look at all the federal government information, I usually lump it in three buckets. There's classified information, classified by statute and by regulations and things that control that world. Usually that stuff's in national security systems, but a little bit of classified goes across into almost every federal agency. Then you have all the controlled unclassified information. Again, information that's been singled out and can be tied back to a specific piece of legislation, directive, policy, regulation that actually requires that information to be protected with certain safeguards and has certain dissemination requirements for that particular type of information. And then there's everything else in that kind of uncontrolled bucket, if you will, all the other type of information. So we are dealing in this project first and foremost with CUI, controlled unclassified information. So why is this information important? Because it's in almost everything that we care about within the federal government. And again, as we're going to show, the feds don't work in isolation. We deal a lot with our contracting partners, state and local governments. We have relationships up and down that big chain. And so this information has to be protected. And it's not just about, hey, it's because of FSMA or the executive order. This gets to the heart of national and economic security. Because I talked about the F-35 and the design documentation. How would you like to be an Air Force pilot knowing that that advanced tactical fighter, that design documentation now is in the hands of our adversaries, our enemy? What are they going to do? They're going to start working on a countermeasure, a weapon system that's going to take that plane out, and they will be years ahead. And so that puts our pilots and our military in great peril. That's why this is a national security problem. Economic security, the adversaries are stealing us blind. Exfiltration, they're taking literally $1 trillion, that was the estimate from the director of NSA, out of the back ends of these systems. And it could be intellectual property, it could be a new software design coming out of the Silicon Valley. It could be some small mom and pop company with a new medical device they've built or designed. It could be General Motors or Ford, Fortune 500 company with the next generation automobile designs. You see, you can't continue to lose intellectual property at the rate we're doing without it affecting the economic security interests of the country as well, because $1 trillion a year with a T, that's getting up to be a third or a fourth of our GDP. And that's unacceptable. You can't sustain this kind of loss, and that's why this project is so important. So you're going to hear the contrast. What's a federal system? Well, it's defined by the Federal Information Security, not Management Act anymore, but the 2014 version of FISMA now is called, it's entitled the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. And so FISMA defines what a federal system is, and what we're talking about for the 800-171 is going to be addressing non-federal systems. And so any system that's not a federal system is going to fall into the other camp, being a non-federal system. Pretty easy. So who operates non-federal systems? Well, usually it's a non-federal organization, and so that's pretty easy to distinguish as well. If you want a simple rule of thumb on what is covered by FISMA, it's any federal agency operating all of our federal systems, or any contractor that's operating an information system specifically on behalf of that federal agency. So for example, if Northrop Grumman is running a data center for TSA or for DoD, that would be under the FISMA legislation, and all the NIST standards and guidelines come into play as you have to protect that system in accordance with the FISMA requirements. So non-federal organizations, well, we have a lot of federal contractors who are not operating systems on behalf of the feds. They just have a contract with the federal government, and some of this critical information that we call CUI is making its way either into the contract or to the contract or through the contract, or they're producing CUI as part of the contractual relationship. And so these are just 3 examples of some of the organizations that are going to be touched by the 800-171. Now, it's no mystery to anybody who's worked in the federal government that we have a lot of stuff at NIST that we throw out at our federal agencies. There's lots of standards, lots of guidance, and when you look at that control catalog in 853, it can be very, very daunting. So the first thing that we had to do when we had our first meeting with John and Pat and Mark and all the folks at NARA, we had to decide on what was going to be our strategy to move forward with this publication. And it was not just a single publication that we were going to be focusing on. It all started back with this executive order, and I know that you guys have probably seen this before, but this is just going to kind of set the top cover for the project that unfolded. And of course, NARA and ISOO have been working since 2010. The heavy lifting came in getting all those federal agencies together and figuring out what are the data types that we should agree on. So we don't have thousands and thousands of things to worry about. We have a disciplined and structured process on how to define the data types that are important to the federal government. Because without that, it's impossible to define the levels of protection, the safeguards, the countermeasures that are needed to protect that data. So this was a very important first step that had to go on. Now the CUI Registry, which I'm describing on this slide, this came about based upon all that hard work that ISOO did with the federal working group. And it was no easy task. I remember sitting in on some of the meetings, and I remember watching the progress. And now we have a wonderful online registry that talks about every data type. They're all categories and subcategories of information. It's very structured, it's easy to understand, and it now is become a rallying point for this project. And that was really the launching point for this project for us, because now we could figure out, we have this information, how do we protect it? So the big picture here is this is not just about 800-171. This is part of a larger project. And the first part, I believe the CUI Rule now has just gone out just in the last week or so. That is an important first phase of this project with regard to protection, because the federal CUI Rule defines the protection requirements for CUI, the Controlled Unclassified Information, when it's within the federal government's jurisdiction, so to speak. And so this is the rule that set the floor of protection at the moderate level. That's moderate in accordance with our FIPS publication 199. And in the executive order, everything that ISOO is doing in this project, they had to be consistent with the NIST standards and guidelines. So there was a natural marriage of our two organizations right from the start. So this is going to define the protection level. Now we're talking about confidentiality. That's the other important point. When NIST looks at the protection of federal information, we deal with all three objectives. Confidentiality, that's protecting from unauthorized disclosure. We deal with integrity, that's unauthorized modification, making sure that doesn't happen. And then there's availability, making sure the data, the information is available to support the missions that are being supported by that information in those systems. The CUI project now starts to take a fairly narrow slice of that security view, so to speak. They're worried for CUI about confidentiality. They want to protect CUI from unauthorized disclosure. So right there, you start to see the first part of the narrowing of this space, so to speak. And we're going to talk about that narrowing in pretty good detail because the requirements that come out in 171 are very targeted. They're very focused. They've been through the mill, so to speak, to make sure that we wrung out everything that was not essential, that we didn't want to convey to the folks who are going to be using this document, either on the federal side, the ones who are going to be using that on our side of the federal government, or the ones who are going to be on the receiving end in the non-federal space. Now, the second part of this overall strategy was to have NIST develop a special publication, which ended up being the 171, that would define the protection requirements for controlled unclassified information using our current security standards and guidelines as the foundation of that work. And then the last part of the strategy, which really is going to make it all happen in a very important way, is the FAR clause, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. You can't apply a set of requirements to the entire contracting space unless there's a FAR rule that goes with that. And that ensures that whatever we're going to do in that contracting space, the general public gets a chance to weigh in. And that kind of is consistent with the NIST comment process. All of our publications go through a public vetting, I call it, or a public comment review. And that's very important. In our country, you know, the vast majority of good things that are happening, industry and all the innovations, they're all going on in the private sector. And so whatever we build on the NIST side, and this is kind of the NARA and the ISOO theme as well, it's important to get all the parties to have their say. Now, sometimes you can't accept every comment, and there's a healthy debate, but at some point you got to lock something down. And so we're going through our final public comment period now on the 171. It's going to close on May the 12th. And then we will lock that publication down and it'll be done. And then the third part of the ISOO strategy will unfold at some point in 2016. I believe that's the date that they're looking at. That'll be the FAR clause. And it'll go through a similar process to the federal CUI rule. Let's talk a little bit about now the actual publication. We want to be able to, first of all, give our federal agencies some sense of what this information, the protection requirements that need to be applied when it moves out of their environment, their direct control. And so the criteria for this one is that when CUI is resident in I talked about non-federal systems, so that's going to be the primary focus. When that CUI moves from the federal side to the non-federal organizations and systems, that's the primary target. And when there are not already specified safeguarding or dissemination requirements that have been stated either through the law, the regulations, or directives, that's the primary target of the 171 and our purpose. And again, I mentioned this point earlier. This is for contractors who are processing, storing, or transmitting CUI, but they're not actually operating a system on behalf of the federal government. A lot of the CUI that we're talking about goes into the non-federal system. And if you go to the the contractor, they're not going to say this is a federal system. That's my system. That's their system. They own it. They operate it. But when you have that special case where they are operating the system on behalf of the feds, then that is on the FISMA side of the law and not under the context of 800-171. So how do we apply these requirements that we've got in 171? Well, they're only applied to those components of an information system where the CUI is being processed, stored, or transmitted. So if these requirements go out to a contractor, and a contractor is a big organization, they're not going to have to apply these requirements to every server and every workstation, every laptop, and every smartphone that they own. They will, however, have to understand where CUI is resident on that large, potentially large system of many, many components, and then be able to apply the requirements to those particular components where the CUI is being stored, processed, or transmitted. So that's going to make it a little bit easier on organizations to actually apply the requirements, because even though we've tailored these requirements a lot, they're still substantial. And I hope by the end of the day you'll see why they have to be that way. So here's just a couple of, this comes from the publication. This is our target audience, and you can see it kind of goes across the board. It can be procurement officials that are needing to understand this document. It can be people who are building systems, lifecycle managers, SDLC, risk management folks. Anybody who does cybersecurity within an organization will have to understand these requirements, because again, as a CISO or an information security officer, your job doesn't stop at the boundary of the agency. When that information that's federal information is going to another area, you've got to be concerned about how it's going to be protected when it gets over there. So a couple of assumptions. These are important to understand. The first one is that we want to make sure that the protection of CUI is consistent, whether the CUI is processing here within the NARA boundary or at TSA, or whether it goes out to the state of Florida or to the University of Arizona. You see, the value of CUI, the criticality, the sensitivity doesn't change because it goes out over the network and lands in somebody else's backyard. It's still the same value. So that's our first assumption. We should make sure that the protection is consistent across the boundaries. Well, I think this one pretty much says the same thing. It needs to be consistent in every way. We don't want to have separate, like a two-stage solution for this information protection. And again, I mentioned this one earlier, the confidentiality level of the CUI is no lower than moderate. And we've had some pretty healthy debates over that as well. But if you look at the definition of moderate impact within our FIPS 199, it's very clear that the loss, the compromise of CUI, or at the moderate level, would have a serious effect on the organization's information, operations, assets, reputation, functions, individuals, serious effect. And of course, it could go up to the high impact where you'd have a severe or catastrophic effect on the organization's assets or operations in that context as well. But certainly, it rises above the low. Low impact is information that has a very limited adverse effect. And if it were to fall at that level, then it really wouldn't be justified to be called CUI. Because just by the definition, CUI is special because it's called out by a law, a directive, a regulation. So it's already been called out to be special for some reason, and therefore that was the rationale for starting at the moderate level. And also the good news is for every federal agency, if you talk to OMB and get the demographic on our systems across the entire federal space, I think well over 70% of our systems are already categorized at the moderate level. So there's a high probability that the CUI that you've identified within your organization is already in one of those moderate systems or high impact. 70% of the systems are moderate. There's about 20% that are low and about 10% that are high impact. So if you find that your CUI happens to end up in one of your low impact systems, then it's probably going to have to be moved to one of the moderate systems, or you may have to elevate the protection level of that low impact system. So again, those are choices that agencies are going to be able to make as they get further into this problem space. Well, here's some additional assumptions, and these were, again, we were looking at trying to put ourselves in the place of a non-federal organization. So, you know, it isn't like the private sector is doing nothing with regard to cybersecurity. They're doing a lot because they've got critical missions and business operations just like we do. And they're also using the same technology. So they're subject to cyber attacks just like we are. Their information is at high level of risk just like ours is. So we made some assumptions that, first of all, they already have some kind of an information technology infrastructure in place. That means that they're using information systems to do business. And that I think is a pretty safe assumption. And they're not going to be developing whole new systems just to protect CUI. We wanted to make sure that whatever we were going to do with regard to requirements, it would be relatively comfortable for those organizations in line with what they're already doing to just kind of fall in line and continue what they were doing. And we also assume they have some level of protection in place, whether they're using the NIST catalog of controls or whether they're using ISO 27000 or the new cybersecurity framework, which kind of is an overview of all of the cybersecurity program activities that you could do. They're protecting their stuff because they have to in order to stay in business. So we know that they're already doing a lot. And that was, again, one of our tailoring criteria. We didn't want to have to tell them things that we already assumed they were doing. Now, it could happen that some of our assumptions, the things that we thought they were doing, they may not be doing. But again, we had to make some design decisions on how these requirements came out. It's also true that every one of these private sector organizations or the non-federals, state and locals, the non-federals in general, they may not always have the resources to provide all of the protections that we would like. And that's, again, could be another problem that we have to face. But they also have the ability to propose alternative measures that they are implementing that could be equivalent to what we're asking for in the 171 requirements. So the bottom line is that you can have a variety of different solutions, different pathways to achieving security, and they're going to be very different. And they may be equally good at the end of the day when we talk about what's the net effect of protecting the data. So you can see that these assumptions are important as you start to work with folks outside of the federal government who are not always marching to the same drum that we are because of our FISMA requirements. So the CUI requirements are fairly simple. I think I've talked about several of these already. Let me go back. They have to be based on the NIST standards and guidelines. That's the kind of the going in position. So we started with FIPS 200, which is our high level set of security requirements. That is a very short document. And there are 17 basic requirements that are, they were designed to help protect federal information and information systems. And it also calls out our, kind of one of our flagship special publications, 853. So this is where we started our discussion with regard to what we're going to end up with on the requirement side. So we know we have to start with the moderate baseline because that's the floor that NARA and ISOO established and is consistent with, reflected in the CUI rule. And so now we sit down and we say, with those starting set of requirements and the moderate baseline, and you know, when you go in the moderate baseline, those of you who are in the federal government, you know that moderate baseline has a lot of controls in it. And this is where we started to do our tailoring process. And we pretty much had three criteria in order to make the cut for what stayed in and what got cut out. The first thing we did, we said, look, anything that comes out of FIPS 200 or 853 that's uniquely federal, we're going to take it out because it just doesn't apply. So things like the old certification accreditation or authorization, now assessment authorization, those two, that's a uniquely federal requirement. Now, I'm not saying the private sector doesn't have senior leaders who take the risk of operating their systems, but they don't have, in general, this formal authorization process. And so that's just one example of a uniquely federal requirement. We also eliminated all the -1 controls. Every family in the NIST 853 starts out with what I call the first control. It's the policy and procedures control. We took all those out because we assumed that organizations that were applying or complying with the requirements, they would most likely have policies and procedures. And again, that was not something that we wanted to have to tell them to do. There's also many controls in the NIST catalog that are what I call uniquely availability related controls. So if you go into one of our big families is the contingency planning family, the CP family. CP is mostly related to availability. Now there is one control that we kept one part of one control in the CP family, and that had to do with backups. I think it was CP9. And we kept one part of that because it's important, even when you're doing a backup, to protect the confidentiality of the backup data. You see, that's one of the kind of the requirements that survive because it's not uniquely for availability. It really had to do with confidentiality. And then, of course, the last one I mentioned earlier, we went through and just took a hard look and said, you think we have to tell people to do this, or should that be kind of expected? In the modern world of running information systems and having security programs, these requirements or these controls, we think that we don't have to tell people to do that. So that's really the three criteria that had to be met in order to survive and end up in the 171. Now we have, I'll talk a little bit later about the appendices that you can actually see our tailoring rationale, how those things actually came about. This slide really talks about the families. You know, in 853 and in FIPS 200, we have 17 families, and you're going to see only 14 families survived this tailoring process. I mentioned the CP family is one of those that didn't survive. And I think that one of the PL family, the planning family, and the SA family, that's the acquisition family, because those controls and those families were just not critical for the protection of the confidentiality of CUI. It didn't rise to that level. So this is kind of what we ended up with. And you can see that there's still a lot there. And the requirements that emerged from these kind of family areas ended up being what we have in the 171. So how do we structure the document? Well, it's fairly simple. Basic security requirement and derived requirements. The basic requirements, when you go through, you'll see usually in the start of every family there'll be the basic requirement. That comes largely from FIPS 200, and it's stated at a fairly high level. One of the things a lot of folks don't understand is when we wrote FIPS 200, we actually went and wrote 853 after FIPS 200. So sometimes FIPS 200 it covers very high-level concepts. Some of those concepts end up getting repeated in security controls, but a lot of the security control work were extensions of those family areas. So least privilege is a security control that you probably won't find in the high-level requirements. So anything that was not in that basic requirement that we still thought was essential, that passed those tailoring criteria, ended up in the derived requirements. So it's kind of a blend of the basic and the derived requirements, but they are all essential in the protection of CUI with regard to confidentiality. So I want to give you just a quick example. I know many of you have actually seen the publication, but this is a quick snapshot, not a complete snapshot because there's a few more derived requirements, but this will give you an idea for configuration management. The basic requirement is split up and everything has a number, so you can actually tag these when you get into the acquisition process sometime in the future or maybe fairly soon. And so you can see the basic requirement breaks down the two high-level requirements in 341 and 342. And then there's a series of maybe 2, 3, or 4, depending on the actual family, of a set of derived requirements which pick up all of those essential parts of 853 security controls that are essential for the CUI part of the problem. Now, we added, after the initial public draft, we added two new appendices. And the reason these appendices were added is to give our customers greater information. So the first appendix provides a mapping table. So you can go in and go into every one of the requirements in the CUI, in the 171, the protection requirements, and you're going to see a mapping to the associated NIST security control that comes from 853. So that can kind of give you a sense of what's been covered and how it's being covered. And then in the next column over, you can see the mapping to the ISO 27001 security controls which map to the NIST controls. That comes out of, that mapping is actually in 800-53, but we brought it forward so many of these customers are going to be in the private sector. They may be using 27001. So we wanted to have them be able to see the traceability from the ISO control to the NIST control back to the CUI requirement. So that's what that one appendix is going to do for you. It's going to give you more information in that area. Now the other appendix that we added, I talked about the tailoring criteria in general terms. This appendix gives you, I call it the details. This is when you get inside the sausage factory and you see how we actually came to that decision. And there's different categories of why the information was tailored out, or the control, or the requirement. And you'll be able to see every one of those security controls in the moderate baseline and what happened, you know, why it made it or didn't make it into the final cut. So where do we go from on the road to going forward? This has been, like I say, a great project for us. I can't tell you how grateful we are to have John and Pat and all the great folks, Mark. They've just been spending countless hours on this project, and we all are so passionate about it because of those many breaches that you've all seen happen, and they're not getting any fewer or any, they're increasing. And so, you know, we're getting to the point now that we would like to be able to make a difference out there, and this is one way that we hope that that's going to happen. So people say, well, how can I use this special code now? It's going to go final in June. We are keeping to that schedule. I know Pat and I talked about this, and we've had to put a lot of things on the back burner because of 800-171, but it's a priority. We know a lot of people are depending on this document. I didn't mention one of our silent partners, the DOD, Gus Gasani, who was around the table with us. Gus used to be at the DOD CIO's office, and he's been just instrumental in helping put together the content for this document. So people say, well, how can I use it now? How can I use it in June when it goes final? Well, you can use it right now in selected contracts. If you've got a contract where you think that these requirements are needed, you can do it on a case-by-case basis. But you can't apply it to every contract within your organization. That is going to have to wait for the FAR clause in 2016. And so you're going to see this story unfolding over the next 12 to 18 months. And so all the pieces are not in place yet, but the 171 is an important linchpin of all of this, because the FAR clause, when it comes out in 2016, it has to be able to point to a specific set of requirements that have been locked down, not just a draft publication or things we think we'd like to do. This is stuff that we've put through the public vetting process, and this is now going to be our rallying point for how do we protect CUI. So you have a little time left. Today's the 8th of May. Our closing day on this is May the 12th, and you can send your comments to us. Let me see if I can get the, there we go. seccert@nist.gov. That's the standard handle that we use for all of our publications. And I strongly encourage you to send in comments, either good or bad. We have to have broad shoulders in this business. Yeah, we get comments from, hey, these documents are the greatest thing since sliced bread, or you've set back computer security for 3 decades. So you have to be able to take all of the input, because that's how we get publications that are good, they're effective, they're technically correct, and we really depend upon you and all of the folks in the private sector to give us that feedback. So that's my patriotic final slide. I think I may have our contact information. I actually had to change my contact slide here, because previously I had all the NIST team on there, but now in this project, it's Pat and his team and Kelly Dempsey, who's not here today. Kelly is one of the authors on the document as well. And again, this is the 800-171 story. I don't know how much time we have left, Pat, but if we have 10 minutes left. If anybody has any specific questions, there are microphones set up on either side here. I would suggest you grab a mic, and if we don't have any comments, then we'll just end a little bit early. Anybody brave enough, or?
Can I make one comment?
Pat.
Yes. I do want to say one thing, that and I think Ron alluded to it during his presentation. We went to brief at the White House on this document. We went to brief Michael Daniel just at the outset of the project, and it was in wake of some huge breaches that had occurred within the federal government, well, actually on the part of a contractor, a huge breach. And the reason for the publication's finalization in June was, in fact, that it was put on a fast track by Michael Daniel. Anyone that would not see the significance or the importance of this document, I put it to you, is on the wrong side of history. Simply on the wrong side of history. The breaches are continuing. The exfiltration is continuing. And what we can do is make things more difficult and limit time on target. That's my comment.
Thanks, Pat. Anybody else have any specific questions? I don't see any. Well, thank you all very much for your patience, and have a great rest of the open house. Thank you guys very much.
I want to thank Dr. Ross for his presentation. Please take advantage of a discussion with him if you didn't want to ask a question in front of everyone. And I tend to be one of these people that likes to have a discussion, just not merely a question, but a discussion with someone, especially someone that knows a lot. Then please take advantage of his presence. I'd like to remind everyone of what we have scheduled for the remainder of the afternoon. At 2 o'clock in this location, we will have Peggy Ushman, who is one of our senior program analysts, speaking to derivative classification program. This is not your run-of-the-mill sort of briefing. She is one of the, I would say, one of the foremost experts in the executive branch on this subject. And I think that if you have an interest in derivative classification and an overview on it, I think it's well worth your time. From our CUI staff, our attorney advisor and the person who maintains our registry, that's Brian Oakland and Dawn Fairchild, are going to be speaking on the registry and its contents and how it was formed, what's its rationale and its structure. And that will take place in the Jefferson Room, also at 2 o'clock. And in the Washington Room, there will be two of the primary people that work these issues, the National Industrial Security Program Overview and also Self-Inspection Program Execution and Reporting will be covered. And again, if these are subjects that interest you, if you need additional information, if you want to dialogue with people that are hands-on involved in these topics on a national level, this is your opportunity. So that's in the Washington Room at 2 o'clock. I thank you very much for your attention, and please take advantage of these activities. We will have, of course, and you can see by these 4 chairs, we will have our panel at 3 o'clock. It will be yours truly and the other 2 associate directors and the director of our office. And we will be taking questions on the various programs that we spoke to this morning. And it will be your opportunity to receive some answers if you'd like to have them at that point. But of course, if you want to talk to me offline or even give me a call, you're quite welcome to do so. And I'm sure that goes with the other associate directors of our organization and our director. Thanks very much. And yes, you had your hand up? No, you were stretching. Okay. Anyway, I wish everyone a very productive afternoon. Please take advantage of these sessions.